listed individual who was going to be here today, Dr. Juma Al-Ghamadi. Apparently he is in Morocco at this moment. He was trying to come this morning, but he is deeply involved with the Libyan crisis and negotiations there. And of course, what we've been reading in the newspapers of what's going on in Libya, particularly in many towns. So I think Juma is probably spending more time there to resolve those issues. I would like to introduce our first speaker. She's an editor of the Middle East Solidarity magazine, a writer and an activist who has published widely on the Arab revolutions. She's co-author with Mustafa Barousi of Breed, Freedom, Social Justice, Workers and Egyptian Revolution, which was published by Z Books in 2014. She recently published a series of articles on the rise of ISIS, which can be read online. In the flyer that you got, the information is there to read that article. The focus of her current research is on leadership, collective action, and social movements in the Middle East. She has a particular interest in Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, post-1945, and labour movements across the region. I think the whole issue of labour movements is quite fascinating in the whole of the Middle East, whether it's expat workers or even the local ones there. So please warmly welcome Anne Alexandra.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you today. And I'm speaking as somebody who is a researcher and a journalist and a writer. I'm not from the region myself. I'm from a British background, but I'm somebody who was deeply affected by the events of 2011. After a long history of engagement with the countries of the Middle East, I was lucky enough to study Arabic as an undergraduate student and went first to Egypt in the 1990s. And so what I'm saying to you today is connected to my academic research and my work, but it's also something that affects me very deeply and very personally. What I want to talk about in my remarks really is to look at a number of things. I'd like to look back to where I would argue the revolutions of 2011 came from. And I would say, I would use the word revolutions in the context of many of the popular uprisings that took place across the region, without trying to claim that these were successful revolutions. I think there's a debate going on about this question at the moment of whether, to be honest, anything happened at all, or whether these were merely a series of sort of relatively minor blip in the dreary round of authoritarian regimes. I think it's very important that we hold on to how much of a change 2011 was, and that it represented the entry of millions of people consciously and openly into attempting to shape their own destiny in a way that hadn't been seen, actually, to be honest, hadn't been seen on a global scale for decades in such large numbers. The people who went into the streets to go on strike, to protest, to join demonstrations, to do all sorts of organising in very creative ways around the demands that were raised across the region, which were for a mixture of very basic things. For bread, freedom and social justice was one of the main demands in Egypt. There were other variations of this, human dignity, and so on, but they all had this common theme. And I think those slogans are important because they link back to what I would argue really are the roots of 2011, and there are two of them. Two basic wellsprings from which this huge, enormous uprising took place. One of which is related to the question of freedom, the question of the way in which the regimes of the region, whether they happen to call themselves monarchies or whether they happen to call themselves republics, a number of those republics seem to be turning into monarchies and handing on power down the generations from Mubarak to Mubarak or from Assad to Assad, or whether they were actually hereditary monarchies. There was a common theme across all of them of being very brutal authoritarian regimes, which largely offered very little space for any dissent, any freedom of expression, any self-organisation by ordinary people outside of the state, insofar as it went into the realms of political life. And the other side of it, though, I'd say was a common theme across all of the region, and something that animated the protests and animated the strikes and continues to be an unresolved issue, was the question of social justice. This is the question of the implementation of neoliberal policies largely, but often in the context of regimes that were partially bringing in policies of privatisation, of austerity, of fitting their economies to the needs of global and regional markets, but leaving behind the needs of ordinary people across the region. And that particularly the processes of neoliberal reforms intensified the gap between rich and poor, intensified the way in which a very small layer of people across the region were benefiting from being better connected to the global economy. And that it was out of that tension, out of the way that people could see, very staring them in the face, the fact that the societies they lived in were both unequal and unfree, that these are the roots really behind the massive popular movements that arose. And I think this is also why the Arab Spring had such a global echo, that it's not an accident that the slogans that were raised in Tahrir Square were taken up immediately in Wisconsin in the US, that in fact the connection between the struggles that were going on in the Middle East, the demands that were being raised for a change in the way that society was organised, even if they were fairly vague and unformed demands at the level of general slogans, had an echo which fed into all sorts of movements. So if you look at the wave of revolutionary uprisings that occurs in 2011, starting in Tunisia with the fall of Ben Ali on the 14th of January 2011, and then sweeping the region really over the next few months. They also went very quickly, it leapt into Europe, directly, I think, inspiring movement in massive movements in Spain, were an inspiration as well for the Occupy movement in the United States, and it also had a massive global echo, and even down into Africa. The movements in 2011 put fear into regimes across the world. The Chinese government banned the mentions of any of the countries in the Middle East on social media. In Zimbabwe, the regime there cracked down on a small group of activists who happened to be watching a video about the uprising in Egypt, and it took them and tried to put them in jail for years because they were so terrified about the idea that that people in Zimbabwe might take inspiration again from the uprisings. And I think that that's because the roots of the uprising were connected to these very deep-rooted causes. I would argue, though, that if you look at the dynamics of the uprisings, the way in which, in particular, revolutions spread from country to country, and why it was that some countries, there were early successes, particularly in Tunisia and Egypt, and why it was, for example, that the revolution in Syria didn't manage to make so much headway. I think that you have to also look at the connection between the democratic and the social demands that were being raised, and particularly the forms of organisation that ordinary people in the region, with the driving force behind the massive protests and the mass movements of early 2011, how those connected together in different and specific contexts. So while the major slogans and the demands were often very similar across the region, they worked out in different ways because the societies themselves were different, and because the political context was different, and the situation was different in each country. So I think if you look at Tunisia and Egypt, you can see, I think, an interaction between democratic and social demands, and between forms of organisation from below, collective action being organised by groups of people who were taking up the issues of the organising, for example, unemployed workers. Lawyers played a big role in organising, but one of the key elements in the Tunisian uprising was the role of the trade union movement, was the role of the Ittihad al-Shughul, the UGTT, the Trade Union Federation, which is a very powerful actor in Tunisian society. In fact, it's one of the bodies that helped to set up the modern Tunisian state. It was one of the organisations that was involved with fighting for independence from colonialism. And it was actually through the trade union movement, through the federation itself, through general strikes that were organised first at the regional level and then were actually forced on the leadership of the federation by the lower ranking activists and members who demanded a general strike at a national level. The day that the general strike happened, the dictator Ben Ali decided to flee, leaving the country. So in the case of Tunisia, you had a combination between demands which actually again started in the Tunisian case around the issues of social justice. That the spark that lit the fire was the suicide of a young man who was refused work and was so marginalised that he could see no hope, and that echoed with many people. But it was actually groups of organised workers through their trade union organisation that played a decisive role in turning that into a blow against the regime that was unstoppable. In the case of Egypt, again, there is an interaction between the more kind of democratic and political demands and the social demands. In the case of Egypt, the Trade Union Federation there was really essentially an arm of the state, and the driving force behind the workers' movement was more independent organisations. Not up until 2011 and the revolution, there were only a very small number of independent trade unions in Egypt. The first were only founded really in a couple of years before the revolution, but there had been hundreds of thousands, in fact millions of workers had gone on strike, had organised at a workplace level, demanding better pay, better conditions, the right to organise, and so on. And that played an important role in unsettling and fracturing, breaking down the mechanisms of authoritarian control over Egyptian society. So one of the critical moments actually in the uprising in 2011 was on the 1st of February. People may remember and have seen on the television screens when the Mubarak regime mobilised thugs to go and attempt to break up the sit-in in Tahrir Square. It's called the Battle of the Camel. People will have seen the pictures of a guy on a camel coming in. Actually, that wasn't the plan. They had to bring the guy on the camel and the thugs because they couldn't get the trade unionists to do it. The people that Mubarak turned to first were Hossein Mugawa and the leaders of the Egyptian Trade Union Federation, and asked them to mobilise people. Mugawa and his cronies attempted to do this and failed. The reason they failed was because millions of ordinary Egyptian workers outside of the union structures had been organising themselves, and they wanted to have nothing to do with a plan to smash up the protests. And many of them were in fact in the square, organising actively and organising strikes. And then following the Battle of the Camel and the failure to crush the sit-in, then there was a wave of strikes which started pretty much spontaneously a few days later, building to a crescendo over the following month. The point about the strikes was not that they were necessarily organised in terms of an organised connection to the revolutionary movement that was developing within the squares. Actually, that connection was relatively weak. But what it did do is it made the country ungovernable. It meant that the military was faced with a very stark choice of, should they let the movement deepen? Should they risk, for example, it starting to spread even to the lower ranks of the army? Should they risk the Suez Canal coming to a halt, the railways coming to a halt? Or should they step in and force Mubarak to leave in order to give themselves a breathing space, which is essentially what they did. I mentioned Syria a minute ago. I would argue, though, in the case of Syria, one of the things that handicapped the development of the popular uprising in Syria was actually that it started largely in smaller provincial towns and was unable to really make a breakthrough in the major urban centres, It went to the suburbs of Damascus, for example, but wasn't able to mobilise mass numbers in the city centres, or to really break down the hold of the regime over the trade unions in quite the same way as had happened in Egypt. And I think this is not to do with some massive difference between Egyptian and Syrian societies. It was actually, I think, more to do with the nature, the character of the regimes themselves. That in the Egyptian case, before the revolution, there had been opposition activists and trade unionists and a wide range of people had successfully created a space in which they could organise. In the case of Syria, there was very little opportunity to do that before the uprising broke out. Broke out under pressure from the rest of the region, and that therefore, in the Syrian case, the dynamic of revolution was much slower and took on a different character. And in fact, it's arguable that because it wasn't able to make such immediate gains very quickly and make bring the country to a complete standstill, this facilitated the regime's very brutal response, which was then to go city by city and encircle, use starvation sieges, use the most brutal means in terms of artillery barrages and so on, to try and beat people into submission. The courage and resilience of the activists in Syria from town after town who defied the regime to raise their demands for democratic change, for freedom and social justice is really inspiring. But unfortunately, they were unable to bring the revolution there to the same degree of early success that happened in Egypt. However, of course, if you look at then Egypt today, it's not true, sadly, that the revolution managed to continue. It essentially stalled in 2012, 2013. 2013, you saw the launch of an absolutely vicious counter-revolution led by the military, and I'll come on to this question in a minute, with the support of other regimes in the region, particularly the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and other regimes from the Gulf, and with the tacit or not so tacit support of the British government, the US government, and other Western governments. So I want to come on now to discuss what it was that the counter-revolution revealed to us, really, about the problems that were facing the revolutionary wave. I'd say there were two sets of problems which came up. The first one, which was, I think, a very pressing question, was the question of the state, of what you should do about the structures of the state. This was raised in a very concrete way in the case of Egypt, where you had the Muslim Brotherhood came partially into, I think you could say, came into office, but not really into power, as a result of first parliamentary elections and then presidential elections in 2011 to 2012, and then were ejected from power in 2013 by the military, and faced an absolutely brutal crackdown ever since. The reason why I posed this question was that the problem that faced the Muslim Brotherhood when they were in government was the fact that the structures of the old state remained very much in place, that actually the Ministry of the Interior was unreformed, the army was completely untouched, the judiciary, although there was a battle within the judiciary, actually the people who were in support of either of reforming the judiciary ended up isolated and excluded, and in fact it was key figures from the old regime's judges who led the charge against Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. That the media was also an area where, although there was openings in terms of a space for independent media to begin to flourish, the actual structures of the state media did not change. The core of this was the role of the army and the Interior Ministry, and you know, I think one of the criticisms that could be put forward of the Muslim Brotherhood when they were in power in Egypt was actually that they didn't take on this question. That they went to the when faced with the Ministry of the Interior, they attempted to work with it and work with the army. I think it could justifiably be argued they're in a difficult position. But I think if you are talking about how to turn the hopes of 2011 to 2012 into real change in the state, this would have to come up very, very squarely, the question of how could real change be effected in the structures of that state? Or does it pose the question of, in order to achieve those hopes for 2011 and 2012, do you actually need a different kind of state altogether? I'll leave that for people to perhaps bring up in the discussion. I want to just finish in the last couple of minutes to look at the other part of the problems that came up, which is the question really of neoliberalism. That actually the reforms that were being pushed through, the economic reforms, privatisation, the austerity, the restructuring of markets and production in the region, or they're kind of being embedded into global markets, leaving behind, as I said, the interests of ordinary people, that this is a global process. So it wasn't just the problem for Egyptian revolutionary activists or those who wanted to see reform and genuine change in Egypt, that they faced the local counter-revolutionaries. They faced a counter-revolutionary that was also organised and partly directed and certainly funded by the Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and that was backed up by Western governments which have professed such great belief in democracy. And if you look at the nexus that emerges around the counter-revolution, you look at the economic conference that took place in Egypt around a year ago, that the British government stands very firmly in that camp, and that is interested in strengthening those, which I think again points to the, in a sense, the hopeful side of 2011. Where I began was the way in which the demands that were raised across the region were seen to be part of something that inspired a global movement, that ordinary people across the world stood in solidarity with people in Bahrain, in Egypt, in Syria, in Tunisia, when they went into the streets and when they demanded change during the revolutions. I think if we're looking forward, it has to be a question of how can we strengthen those connections between people who are fighting for democracy and social justice in the region with people in Europe, in North America and elsewhere in the world who share those goals and share those aspirations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and as I said, very erudite and detailed presentation in a very short space of time. You've done an admirable job. I think there's lots of questions that are going to be raised, and I think we'll have a good debate. Our next speaker, I want to move rapidly on, is a political activist and a member of the Bahrain's opposition bloc in UK. He witnessed the unfolding of the 14th February revolution and was a regular participant at Pearl Roundabout. I must also admit that I was also there at that time. I spent 4 nights at Pearl Square, and we feel very privileged that I was able to witness what was going on. And I endorse what Anne was saying, that even at Pearl Square you had different stands of unionists, school teachers, lawyers, and all kinds of things. It was a fascinating experience, but it's a pity that it fizzled out. But as we say, inshallah, with the will of God, things will improve and change there. So our next speaker, he left Bahrain after the Saudis sent their troops in mid-March, and I left 24 hours before the Saudis arrived there. So,
because of you, we failed.
Thank you very much. He had studied marketing and management and worked with various companies in the field. He had been detained by Bahrain's notorious security forces headed by Ian Henderson. Now, who's this chap? Ian Henderson sounds very English. In the 90s, he endured severe torture and abuse. Please welcome Ali Al-Fayaz. Sorry, I meant to say British, not particularly English, but you know, there you are. You have to tarnish everyone with the same brush, I suppose. Please, brother.
I'm surprised your name still did not appear in any of the...
No, I was wearing a blonde wig at that time, that's why.
Yeah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think the question is very clear. After 5 years, what went wrong? And I want to talk about Bahrain in particular. This case, I think, goes across the countries, maybe using different strategies, different names, and different slogans. But end of the day, it is the same problem we're facing across countries, from Tunisia to Bahrain to Syria to Yemen and other countries. So for this, I wrote a small case study about Bahrain, which will open up horizon for us and answer many questions. The Bahraini people have been struggling politically, trying to push for democratic, inclusive political system for almost a century now. There have been projects and movements attempting to achieve real democratic transformation before, during, and after British colonial rule. The 1973 Bahraini constitution was drafted and agreed upon after supposed withdrawal of Britain from Bahrain in 1971. The constitution formed the base for rule of law and people's representation in the parliament. However, it was repealed in 1975, 2 years after it was formed and agreed upon. And the parliament was dissolved and emergency security law was adopted. This was a decision made mainly by the appointed Prime Minister, Khalifa. In 1994, national political leaders from different background and ideology signed a petition calling for the end of emergency security law.